When looking for the king of podcasts, you're at the wrong channel.
Well, excuse me!
Looking for good ideas for life? You're far from good hands.
Hey, bud, what's your problem?
If you think the listener is always right, you're far from the right place.
Out of order! Even in the future, nothing works!
Hosted by a Northeasterner by birth, but a rebel by choice.
Are you threatening me?
If you want a host that floats between love and madness,
and we know the night is always gonna be here anyway. Thinking of you's working up my appetite. Looking forward to a little afternoon delight.
then play on and listen to Crazy Train Radio.
All right, guys, listen to this blues riff and B. Watch me for the changes and try and keep up, okay?
Within the gaming world, there are your general gamers, but then there are those that enjoy the dark underbelly of gaming. If you're one of those that enjoy the dark underbelly of gaming, we certainly got the place to send you. Scorpion Lair Games. That's right, Scorpion Lair Games is the creators of the true crime hit Killers, the card game. Let's not forget they also have Killers Clothing Company, the profiler game, and things like the 5-Minute Murder channel on YouTube. And we certainly can't forget the new book that is certainly a hit, Beyond the Headliners, True Crimes, Myths, and Legends. Make sure you visit Jeff and the Scorpion Lair Games on Facebook and everywhere today.
Hi, I'm Eleanor Johnson, the author of Scream With Me, and you are listening to Crazy Train Radio.
Hey folks, it's your least favorite host in the podcast world, Croc, Jonathan Steele. And boy, do we have a good one for you today.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, starting us in the dark, but it is what it is. And I'm going to steal the Jerry Lawler line, making my roll on, roll off, because this next guest has a book out. Well, she has several books out, and she was just actually talking about her new one in the works. But I learned of her because of this book, Scream With Me, Horror Films and the Rise of American Feminism from 1968 to 1980. And I feel out of my element, but she said don't sweat it. But she is a professor from Columbia University. She has her degrees in English, and she's actually a doctor too, a Ph.D. doctor. But we'll get into all of that. But the author is Eleanor Johnson.
Hello. Quiet, numbskulls, I'm broadcasting.
Hello, how are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
And it's, cool And it worked out because we were talking initially on the phone, and she said, "Hey, I'm actually going to be in Philly, so here we are."
Here we are.
So I'll go with the education first. You got your BA at Yale, then you went out to Berkeley, University of California, for your PhD.
Yep.
So what made you go the direction you went with the education?
In terms of which schools I went to?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And studying what you did.
Well, actually, when I first went to college, I thought I was going to study science and be a doctor. And I had this whole plan about that, like a medical doctor, which, as you rightly point out, I'm not a medical doctor. I would not go to me for medical advice. But when I went to college, I thought I wanted to be a medical doctor. And then what happened was I kind of accidentally took a class that was taught by a medieval literary professor. And I loved the class and I loved him and I loved working with him. And it was totally transformative. And so after that, I just started studying more and more literature and more poetry. And I made that my education. And after I graduated from college, I took some time off. I worked in publishing for a while. And then eventually I decided I wanted to go back to school and get a degree in literature. So I did that.
Now, also, I think we talked about this a little bit on the phone during our initial conversation. You have an interest in like medieval culture besides the feminism and the horror.
Yep.
What was it about the medieval culture that caught your attention? Because it was funny, and I told you that thanks to a stuntman and actor I know in Southern California, I got connected. Yes, Anthony, love bragging about you. Anthony DeLongis, and done stuff for 50 years. Hooked me up when I was at his house with a gentleman named Stephen Fick up in San Jose.
Okay.
That runs Davin Rich Martial Arts School.
Okay.
Where they do a lot of the lessons are from the old Italian philosophy, and so he teaches sword fighting, grappling, all kinds of things, and even the medieval style of fighting.
Yep.
So where did your interest
I tend to really like stuff that's a little bit difficult and unfamiliar. I think actually it's part of what I like about horror too. I like the fact that in a good horror movie, you don't usually know exactly what's going on until you're pretty deep in the movie, right? That sense of confusion and uncertainty. I like that. I like having to figure out a puzzle. And medieval literature and medieval culture are kind of like, you can recognize that they're related to contemporary American culture and to the contemporary English language, but they feel kind of difficult and almost like a little locked up. And so I love kind of unlocking that puzzle of that historical difference and like looking at these, languages and works of literature and also theology. I study a lot of medieval theology that kind of help to shape American culture and really contemporary American culture in really subtle ways. So what attracts me to the Middle Ages is that it's like clearly related to the world we live in now, but also like kind of clotted and gnarled up a little bit and different enough to be really difficult and engaging.
Absolutely. So I think I sent you Steven's information, but when we're done, I'm actually going to call him and do a formal introduction.
Great.
But the book is obviously compelling and timely explanation of many things, not only the horror genre, but different topics from both the female side of things, but in worldly topics.
Yeah.
So if I remember this correctly, and obviously I got notes, so I'll be glancing back and forth, but this started, you were teaching a horror class in particular for this book.
Yep.
And it was around the time that Roe versus Wade was being announced of the change, I should say.
Yeah.
Because of, or it was actually released for press release before the formal announcement came in. And it became something you and the class were talking about.
That's right.
So what actually happened here? And
yeah, so I mean, part of my interest in horror films is that I think horror films are a really interesting lens that you can look at to see what a culture is worried about or thinking about or stressed out about at any given time. And in the late 1960s, when the movie Rosemary's Baby was released, Americans, and in particular Americans living in New York, were really, really anxious about women's reproductive rights. Because in the 60s, many American women simply died because of lack of access to the kind of reproductive medicine that they needed. And this was all over the newspapers in 1965, 1966, 1967, 1968, when Rosemary's Baby was released. So when I teach Rosemary's Baby, I teach it in the context of all of that reproductive fear that was circulating in American culture. And I teach the film as really kind of a parable about the dangers of women not having reproductive autonomy, right? Like, if I don't know if everybody's seen the movie, so quickly, I'll just say in Rosemary's Baby, like the core plot element is that Rosemary is raped, and then she's made to carry that pregnancy to term, which is the Antichrist, without knowing like who her assailant was, or really that she was assaulted, or that the baby is like a demon baby. So it's a parable about the danger of denying women reproductive self-determination. So I gave this lecture about that. And then the next day, the Supreme Court's decision to reverse Roe v. Wade was leaked. And so I thought, okay, I know that I think that horror is a really important way of thinking about women's rights. I mean, you can look at almost any horror subgenre, and there's some kind of relationship to women's rights in there. Slasher movies, of course, horror movies that have to do with danger in the home, of course. And Rosemary's Baby was this big one about reproductive rights. So then I had a sabbatical, I had some time off, and I decided I would just start looking into what other mainstream horror films from the 60s and 70s during the heyday of American feminism were doing interesting stuff about women's rights. And as soon as I started looking, it was like plunk, 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 like all these glorious ripe fruit sort of fell from the tree. And I was thinking about The Exorcist and The Stepford Wives and all these other
Shining, The Omen, and
that's right.
You discussed six different films of that era.
Yeah.
So it's amazing when you think about it. And I think this is something we were talking about briefly, going back and forth texting.
Yeah.
And I was doing my homework, and this is where I was saying, man, I better step up my game and stuff, but it's funny, you would totally get this in terms of once you start going down one alley of research, then you get 3 to 6 more doors that open up.
That's right.
And as someone who was a history background and still has the history background, and I specialized in presidential history.
Oh, wow.
Early American history, which happens, we're going to have the 250th anniversary this Saturday as of this taping. And obviously, our first nation's capital was Philadelphia. So, I got a lot of digging there.
Yeah.
So it's like, you read one thing, then you read 6 more things, and then it's just a different loop.
Yeah, totally.
So, what was the most important thing or interesting thing that you saw once you started digging and looking at all the different?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And the truth is, the topic of like women's rights in horror is so rich. I had like a lot of kind of revelations, but I think the biggest, most shocking moment for me was I was rewatching The Exorcist, because I had this kind of gut level sense that The Exorcist needed to be in the conversation with the other films I was interested in, but I hadn't seen it in a while. And as I was rewatching it, I was like, I don't know if I can really say that this film is like a domestic horror, which is the sort of subgenre of horror that I talk about in Scream With Me, horror where it's really the home that's the central place of danger. It's the people in the home that are sometimes causing the danger, like Rosemary Woodhouse's husband in Rosemary's Baby. And I was like, well, but like in the case of The Exorcist, it's not really like a person in the home that's causing the danger. It's like a demonic possession. And then all of a sudden I thought, oh my gosh, I think that in this film, the demon really is kind of like a symbol or an allegory for the reality of many American women and many women in all of history, which is that they are, in fact, the possessions of the men that they're married to, or, the households that they live in. And this was actually an instance, going back to your prior question, when my training as a medievalist really helped me, because I spent years, I still study it, studying medieval property law and medieval marriage law. And in the logic of medieval law, women were literally the possession of the man, right? Like once they got married, your husband like owned you, right? And that logic persisted well past the Middle Ages in English law and into American law, so that, for example, if a husband sexually assaulted a wife during marriage, there wasn't even a way to prosecute him or like bring charges against him until 1984 in the United States, because the notion was that like, well, she couldn't say no to him because he owned her. And so once I started thinking about ownership and possession as like a reality that women faced in, being kind of rendered a possession in their own homes, I started looking at The Exorcist again, and I was like, oh my gosh, this whole idea of like a demon possessing the daughter and the wife in the home, that's not, I mean, yeah, it's supernatural in the movie, but it's also just like, it's sort of like a supernatural metaphor for an actual legal reality that women and children faced in the 1970s, which was that they were in effect legally owned by the father of the household. And so once I saw that, I saw the whole Exorcist movie totally differently. So like there's a very canonical scene, which if people haven't seen the movie recently, this is very easy to find this scene like on YouTube in pieces when Chris McNeil, played by Ellen Burstyn, who's the mom in The Exorcist, she goes to meet Father Damien Karras for the first time in a park. And when she goes to see him, she's got like a trench coat on and the collar's turned up real high, and she's got these big like bug-eyed dark glasses on and kind of a scarf over her head to cover missing chunks of hair, because the reality is that she has been being domestically abused by this demon in the house. Now, there wasn't really a language for talking about this kind of abuse in 1970s America. So the film and the filmmakers and everyone who was involved in the film, they kind of use this kind of demonic idea to showcase how women were vulnerable to extreme physical violence in their own homes because of this kind of possession thing that's going on through, the history of law and American culture. So realizing that like the demonic possession idea was in itself actually political was a total revelation for me. And realizing that, that scene with Chris, she looks like a domestic abuse victim, right? I mean, and she's designed to look like a domestic abuse victim. And when she like pulls off her sunglasses, she's got this huge bruise along her cheekbone. That was like to women surviving situations of abuse during that period, watching that film, I don't think they would have been confused at all about what they were looking at, right? They were looking at an abuse victim. And yes, in the film, the abuser's a demon, but it's like a male demon who's taken possession of the house. So that was a huge revelation for me, that the supernatural elements in these horror movies were usable as ways of representing like actual dangerous domestic realities that women and also children were facing in the period, like before we had like a kind of a robust cultural understanding that domestic violence is bad and that we should combat it, because it was absolutely rampant in the 1970s. So then I did a bunch of research about that, and it turns out that it was right after The Exorcist was in theaters, which The Exorcist was released to theaters on December 26th of 1973. And it was in 74 that you see this almost vertical escalation of public awareness about how bad domestic violence is. And and like all these like state and local initiatives to help women who were trapped in dangerous situations in the home, it skyrockets, right, when The Exorcist is in theaters. And I started to think, oh my gosh, like Rosemary's Baby helped advance the cause of women's reproductive rights. And The Exorcist helped advance the cause of women in dangerous situations in the home. And I really hadn't expected the book to go in that direction. I thought it would all be about reproductive justice.
Yeah.
And it just totally changed. And so that was probably my biggest surprise.
Well, two things here. And well, the one that stood out when you were saying that is I was thinking about something my mom told me about her parents. And I was fortunate enough to know her parents. And there was never aggression or you're my property, anything like that. But the thing my mom was telling me was my grandmother needed a hysterectomy for a medical reason, but they still needed my grandfather's permission.
Yeah.
And he obviously got it, was cool. And if we got to do it, we got to do it. But it was during this time period.
Fascinating.
They still wanted his permission and to sign off in case that I want to have more kids or I want to, but no, he was like, hey, if it's a medical thing, let's do what we got to do. But I want to go back to Rosemary's Baby for a second.
Sure.
And you were talking about, especially in New York, and you did some research on this as well.
Yep.
There was, and this is obviously before Roe versus Wade, and there was obviously things illegal to have an abortion unless it was medically necessary. in the state anyway, in the research that I've seen.
Yep.
So can you talk about the change in the evolution of the thought process, not only for abortion, but just everything and domestic violence and everything within this 12-year period that you focus on?
Yeah. So the overarching trend is like pretty clear and easy to outline. Between 68 and 80, women's rights in the United States just plain old got better. Women had more reproductive autonomy. And I get that abortion is a very complex issue. Like, I know where I am on the spectrum. I respect the positions of people who are not where I am on the spectrum. But the reality is that in 68, 69, 70, up to 73, when Roe v. Wade finally passed, American women were just dying left, right, and center. And people were stressed about that. So, between 68 and 80, women's rights got better. Women got safer. They got reproductively safer. They got safer in their homes because, in 1968, there were 0 domestic violence shelters in the United States. By 1980, there was something like 300. So it was just an absolutely steep incline. The Equal Rights Amendment was also trying to pass between 73 and about 79. It didn't ultimately pass. But, women's rights were on stage for a really, really long time. And overall, things really got better. And I think that part of what helped the culture kind of digest that all this stuff was happening, where there were all these horror films showing, women needing more autonomy, needing more safety in the home, things like that. So, in terms of like the overall trajectory, that's the biggest kind of trend you see in this period. But to speak a little bit more about the reproductive stuff in New York in particular, because it is a fascinating history and one I hadn't known at all as much about as I thought I did. So like in the mid 60s, New York State tried to liberalize its abortion laws, specifically so that women who were the victims of rape, for example, would be allowed to terminate pregnancies, because that was not a grounds for abortion prior to a certain moment in New York State history. And in, I think it's like 67, 68, that law to liberalize abortion rights just in New York, only to include, really acute health crises and rape victims, it failed. Like I'm from New York, our like Congress just kept shooting it down. Then Rosemary's Baby's released in mid 68. And by 1970, the New York State legislature didn't just liberalize abortion, it legalized abortion. So like suddenly it was, you didn't even have to be like a rape victim or terminally ill or something. You could just terminate a pregnancy. And I don't need to get into like whether that's an intrinsic good or an intrinsic bad. It's just very interesting to notice that Rosemary's Baby, which was on screens for like a year from mid 68 to mid 69, it changed the conversation. And if you look at news coverage, which I do a lot in Scream With Me, like coverage in the New York Times, in 1965, 1966, 1967, most of the conversation in the news about abortion focuses on 2 things. 1, women are dying. Nobody feels good about that.
No.
And 2, the doctors feel hamstrung. So there's a lot of doctors who are like, I performed an abortion that I felt was medically necessary, and now I've lost my license, and that sucks. So there's sort of, we're worrying about women dying, and we're worrying about medical autonomy, like the autonomy of the doctors. Those were the 2 major things that were in the press. Long about 68, 69, like right when Rosemary's Baby's in theaters, and right after, you start to get this very different language in the press. And it has to do, the New York Times uses phrases like the sort of like archaic practice of tormenting women by forcing them to carry pregnancies that maybe were forced upon them by rape or that are causing them serious health crisis. So the discourse shifts from like, oh my God, that's a lot of dead girls, and oh my God, that's a lot of awkward situations for doctors, to suddenly it's like, maybe this is just wrong to do to women. Maybe it's archaic, maybe it's hurtful, maybe it's not safe. You start to get language about bodily autonomy. You start to get language about like the phrasing like, abortion should be a decision between a woman and her doctor, which we're totally used to now.
Yeah, go figure, right?
Go figure. And that was nowhere in the discourse before like the time that Rosemary's Baby's in theaters. And if you've seen that film recently, or if you haven't, that's a film that really hinges on the question of whether Rosemary can have a free conversation with her own doctor or not. Like the crisis scene is one when Rosemary realizes there's this horrible conspiracy and she runs off to a doctor she likes, Dr. Hill. And when she gets there, she tells him what's been going on, and he basically narcs on her to another doctor. And so the trust between her and her own doctor is broken.
Mm-hmm.
So the film set up New Yorkers to like look not just at the film, but at reality, and to say like, there's a problem here. This is horror. And in fact, to me, the most powerful scene in all of, I'll say moment, the most powerful moment in all of Rosemary's Baby is during the scene where she's being raped by Satan. And she says, this is no dream. This is really happening. That was true, right? In New York State in 1968, a woman could be a rape victim and not be allowed to have any autonomy over what to do about a pregnancy that might result. And like, as I said, I have a lot of compassion for people who worry about fetuses and the souls of the fetus. But like, wherever you stand on abortion, it wasn't a dream. What happened to Rosemary, being raped and forced to carry a pregnancy to term, was happening to untold thousands of American women. And it was hard for the women, right? And it was scary and it was horror. And so that film packaged all that thinking up in a way that Americans and New Yorkers could stand, and not even stand, could really hear and see, right? You watch Rosemary's Baby, you don't have sympathy for her husband or for the devil. They're clear bad guys. You have sympathy for her. So the film taught Americans, and particularly New Yorkers, how to think about abortion, not just as a question of like, well, who should have the right to have a pregnancy and not, but to think about the woman's bodily and psychological well-being as a concern. And I think that the film was like a training ground for that, and that it's not an accident that New York State, which had failed to even have the rape exception work, suddenly was like, oh, you know what? We should just decriminalize abortion altogether. And in the early 1970s, before Roe, people were flying into New York from all around the country to terminate pregnancies because the laws in New York were so much more liberal than almost anywhere else, not anywhere else, but almost anywhere else in the United States.
Yeah. And I don't care what anyone thinks or if they change their opinion about me. I'm all for women and being able to have a conversation with their doctor and what is in their best interest.
Mm-hmm.
So, and obviously this was a conversation recently in the past couple of years with the overturning of Roe and such, but I'm not going to trust my government officials. God bless them. But unless you're a medical doctor or have knowledge in the area, when it comes to that, I'm going to trust the medical professionals with that.
Yeah, and I think that that's part of what the film opened up for New Yorkers and Americans to think more about.
Now, that law you were talking about, was that the one originally thrown out by Alice Paul in like the early 20s? As far as the Equal Rights Amendment.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the Equal Rights Amendments gets kind of braided together with the reproductive justice movement in the period. But there was like a specific concrete, like New York State legislature law number, whatever it was, that was trying to liberalize abortion law in really discrete ways. And the thought was that it would make fewer women die and fewer doctors get prosecuted. Because again, those were the major things that the press was talking about at the time. But it failed, and it failed by a huge margin in the New York State legislature when it failed. And then again in 1970, when New York just went ahead and legalized it, it passed by a huge margin. It wasn't like neck and neck against in 1968 and then neck and neck for in 1970. It was like no one supported liberalization in 68. And then everyone supported legalization in 70. So something in the spirit of the state really, really changed. And I'm someone who deeply believes that art, powers political change and like enables changes in cultural consciousness. And I think we have horror films to thank for a lot of what happened in the 70s for women.
What would you say it was like in terms of writing about film and topic on film compared to other things you've written about? Because you also have a Substack, and you've done DCs and different things along the way, a certain style of writing.
Yeah.
But writing about film
is
a totally different beast.
It is a totally different beast, and I definitely had to learn some new moves. So my first 3 books before Scream With Me were all academic books. And they were all about medieval literature, medieval culture, medieval theology, medieval philosophy. And so when I was writing those books, I had to picture, and was really only supposed to picture, writing for other experts. So none of those books are like books I would recommend anybody read while sitting on the beach. You know what I mean? Like they're all nerdy, like super nerdy, kind of industry books for other scholars. And I had learned how to write for that audience. When I wrote Scream With Me, you're writing about film. Loads of people have seen these films, right? So I wanted to write a book that anyone who liked horror could plausibly pick up and read. So I had to start picturing like a totally different reader in my mind. In fact, the readers that I imagined for Scream With Me, I pictured my own undergraduate students because they're smart and engaged and sort of skeptical, right? Like my students are really kind of amazing. And so I thought I have to make the book fun and dynamic and gettable, but also like persuasive and a little bit provocative. I don't want to lose people's interest. So I had to learn kind of a new voice for writing. And the other thing that was really different for me is like, as you say, film is a totally different beast, in part because like with poetry, you can kind of look at the text and there the text is, and it's really all about what's written on the page. Whereas when you're looking at a film, you have to think about like, who reviewed this? How was it reviewed? Like, how long was it in theaters? What kind of money did it make? None of those questions have any meaning at all when you're not looking at film. But, for example, The Exorcist was on screens for like 100 weeks, which I think is even hard for us to imagine now. Films don't stay in the theaters for 2 years anymore. We have too much media stimulation. But basically why that matters is that popular American culture had to kind of sit with that film for a long, long, long time. So I got to think about how a cultural work that's like available to millions of people, that's available for 2 years, how that gets digested. And that kind of thinking you don't really do when you're reading poetry or theology. It's just a different place in the culture.
Absolutely. So obviously, some of the same topics that we're talking about from the time period of the book that you look at, like I've mentioned before in other outlets and stuff, is it seems like we regressed in certain ways and having some topics.
Yep.
So with what you talk about in the book, on the serious note, where do you stand and what is your thought process of where we're looking at things from a 2026 lens? Because you would think we would have been so far ahead, but we're regressing in some ways.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, unfortunately. Yeah, I think that this is a period of time when women's rights are under threat in a way that they have not been since the mid-1970s. It's actually part of why I wrote the book, to sort of say, like, here we are in the 2020s, but actually, if you want to understand what's going on in the 2020s, you got to look at the 70s, because that was the last time that women's rights were so embattled. The difference, of course, is that then women's rights were going in this direction, and now they're going in this direction. So I'm worried, but in my heart, I am, as always, an optimist. And I think that as long as like young, justice-oriented American artists continue to make films, not necessarily even young, but as long as people continue to make art, there's every reason to hope that this downturn in civil rights will be corrected. Because I believe deeply in like the American notion that everyone should have equal civil rights. And I think that most Americans believe that too. I think we're in this weird nest of confusion powered by things like social media and people being in their own little wormholes of like whatever posts and streams and whatever, where people are in a panic that somebody other than them might have more rights than they have. I don't think that rights are kind of a closed economy in that way. I think everyone can have all the rights. Like that's the promise of our nation state. And I do believe we can get back to that. And I think that, like I said, I think art makers are our best hope. It's not going to be our legislators right now. Too much confusion in Washington. But, people who make films, I want to see them making more feminist films. I see them making more feminist films.